Cold winds swept across the hills surrounding Ashford Manor, rattling the old windows and covering the gardens with silver frost before dawn. Inside the enormous estate, servants hurried through corridors carrying firewood and candles while Lord Cedric Ashford sat beside the grand fireplace studying letters from London with the same stern expression he wore for nearly everything. Above him hung portraits of generations who had cared more about titles than happiness. The Ashford family had always been respected. But respect, Eveline had learned long ago, was not the same thing as love. She stood near the library window watching snow gather along the stone paths below. In the distance, bare trees swayed beneath the grey sky while the village beyond the hills disappeared beneath winter fog. "You're hiding again." Rosalind's voice broke the silence. Eveline glanced over her shoulder as her younger sister entered the library wrapped in a dark blue cloak, cheeks pink from the cold outside. Unlike Eveline, Rosalind carried warmth everywhere she went. People smiled when she entered rooms. Servants relaxed around her. Even their father's expression softened sometimes when he looked at her. Eveline had never inspired that reaction in anyone. "I am reading," Eveline replied calmly. "You've been staring out the window for 10 minutes. That still counts as thinking." Rosalind laughed softly before closing the library door behind her. But the smile faded almost immediately, replaced by nervousness Eveline recognized at once. Something was wrong. Rosalind crossed the room slowly and stopped beside the fireplace, twisting her gloves together in her hands. "There's news from London," she said quietly. Eveline waited. Rosalind swallowed. "The Duke of Blackthorne is searching for a wife." The room suddenly felt colder. Even Eveline, who avoided society whenever possible, knew the name Adrian Ravenshire. Everyone in England knew it. The Duke of Blackthorne. Men respected him carefully. Women feared him quietly. Stories followed him across counties like shadows. Some claimed he had once challenged a nobleman to a duel without raising his voice once during the argument. Others whispered about a broken engagement years earlier that had turned him into a man incapable of tenderness. No one seemed to know which stories were true. But everyone agreed on one thing. The Duke was dangerous. And? Eveline asked softly. Rosalind looked miserable. "Father received an invitation this morning. We are to attend the winter masquerade in London next month." Understanding settled immediately between them. Lord Cedric would never ignore an opportunity like this. A connection to the Duke of Blackthorne would raise the Ashford family higher than ever before. Eveline turned back toward the window. "Then you should begin preparing your gowns." Rosalind stared at her. "That's all you have to say?" "What else should I say?" "That father intends to offer me to him." Eveline finally looked at her sister again. Rosalind's eyes were shining with fear. Not nervousness. Fear. And suddenly Eveline understood something else entirely. "There is someone," she said quietly. Rosalind looked away. Silence confirmed everything. Eveline's chest tightened. "Who?" For a moment Rosalind said nothing. Then, very softly. "Captain Elias Whitmore." Eveline blinked in surprise. Elias Whitmore had returned from military service months earlier. He was intelligent, kind, respected in the village despite lacking noble blood or fortune. Eveline had noticed the way he looked at Rosalind during church gatherings. Apparently Rosalind had noticed too. "He asked to marry me 2 weeks ago," Rosalind whispered. "I said yes." "And father?" "He would never allow it." "No. He would not." To Lord Cedric, marriage was strategy. Wealth. Reputation. Love had never entered the conversation. Rosalind stepped closer desperately. "Eveline, I cannot marry the Duke. You have not even met him." I do not need to meet him. Her voice trembled. Everyone says he is cruel. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Cruel men usually announced themselves loudly. The stories surrounding Adrian Ravenshire were stranger than that. They carried sadness beneath the fear. But she said none of this aloud. What do you want me to do? She asked instead. Rosalind hesitated. Then she spoke the words that changed everything. I need you to distract him. Evelyn stared at her. What? Only temporarily, Rosalind rushed to explain. Long enough for Elias and I to leave England and marry quietly in Scotland. Father will focus entirely on you and the Duke. That is absurd. I know it is. You expect me to pretend interest in the most feared nobleman in England? Rosalind grabbed her hands. Please. Evelyn pulled away immediately, unsettled by the desperation in her sister's voice. This is madness. I love him. The words echoed through the library. Simple. Honest. Painfully real. Rosalind rarely cried, but tears now filled her eyes anyway. If father forces this marriage, her voice broke. I will never be happy again. Evelyn looked at her younger sister standing beside the firelight trembling with fear, and something inside her softened despite herself. Rosalind had always protected her in small quiet ways growing up. When children mocked Evelyn for being too serious, Rosalind defended her. When their father ignored her accomplishments, Rosalind celebrated them anyway. And now Rosalind looked completely terrified. What exactly is your plan? Evelyn asked slowly. Hope flashed instantly across Rosalind's face. The masquerade ball is next month. If the Duke notices you instead of me, father will encourage it immediately. Why would the Duke notice me? Rosalind almost smiled. Because men always notice you when you stop trying to disappear. Evelyn rolled her eyes softly, but heat rose unexpectedly to her cheeks. You exaggerate. I do not. Before Evelyn could answer, heavy footsteps echoed outside the library. Both sisters straightened immediately. Lord Cedric entered moments later wearing a dark velvet coat, silver threading glinting beneath candlelight. His sharp eyes moved between his daughters carefully. The carriage leaves for London in 3 weeks, he announced. Neither interrupted. The Duke of Blackthorne will attend the masquerade personally. You will both conduct yourselves accordingly. His gaze settled on Rosalind first. You will wear the emerald gown. Rosalind lowered her eyes obediently. Yes, father. Then, unexpectedly, his attention shifted toward Evelyn. And you? Evelyn met his stare calmly. Try not to hide in corners all evening. Without another word, he turned and left the room. Silence followed behind him. Rosalind exhaled shakily. Evelyn returned to the window, though her thoughts no longer rested on snow or winter hills. The Duke of Blackthorne. 3 weeks later, London glittered beneath thousands of lanterns. The winter masquerade filled Ravenshire Palace with music, jewels, and enough nobility to suffocate half the kingdom. Golden chandeliers illuminated silk gowns and polished marble while masked guests moved gracefully through enormous halls scented with roses and candle wax. Evelyn hated every second of it. You look beautiful, Rosalind whispered beside her. Evelyn adjusted the silver mask covering part of her face. I look uncomfortable. That too. Rosalind smiled nervously, though tension remained visible beneath it. Every noble family in the ballroom waited for the Duke's arrival. The atmosphere shifted each time the palace doors opened. Whispers spread continuously. Has he arrived? Did you hear he refused 3 proposals already? They say he dismissed a countess without even dancing with her. Evelyn stood near the balcony trying not to regret coming entirely. Then the music faltered. The ballroom went quiet. And the Duke of Blackthorne entered. Adrian Ravenshire wore black from head to toe. No decorations. No unnecessary jewels. His silver mask only sharpened the intensity of his features rather than hiding them. Tall. Calm. Unreadable. People moved aside for him instinctively. Not because he demanded it. Because his presence simply made them. Eveline watched noblewomen immediately straighten their posture while noblemen offered greetings too eager to appear natural. The Duke acknowledged almost none of them. His expression remained distant, detached from the spectacle surrounding him. Then his gaze shifted across the ballroom. And landed directly on Eveline. Something tightened painfully in her chest. Even across the crowded room, his attention felt unnervingly direct. He began walking toward her. Rosalind made a small panicked sound beside her. Oh no. Eveline ignored her. The Duke stopped only a few feet away. Up close, he looked even more dangerous somehow. Not violent. Worse. Intelligent. Like a man who noticed everything. Lady Ashford, he said smoothly. His voice was lower than she expected. You know who I am? Eveline asked before thinking. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. England has discussed the Ashford sisters for weeks. That sounds exhausting for England. For one brief second, surprise flickered in his eyes. Then amusement. Actual amusement. I was told your sister was the charming one, he said quietly. Rosalind nearly choked beside them. Eveline should have apologized. Instead she replied, people exaggerate frequently. The Duke studied her carefully. Not her gown. Not her face. Her. As though trying to understand something hidden beneath the surface. You do not seem happy to be here, he observed. Neither do you. Another pause. Then, incredibly, Adrian smiled. Small. Brief. Real. And suddenly Eveline understood why rumors followed this man everywhere. Because when Adrian Ravenshire focused his attention fully on someone, the rest of the world disappeared around them. I dislike crowded rooms, he admitted. So do I. Yet here we are. For unfortunate reasons. The corner of his mouth lifted again. Across the ballroom, Eveline could practically feel society staring at them. Whispers had already begun. The Duke glanced toward the balcony doors. Would you prefer air to conversation? Eveline hesitated. Every instinct warned her to refuse. But curiosity betrayed her. Yes, she answered softly. Outside, winter air swept across the marble balcony while snow drifted slowly over London rooftops below. The music became distant behind closed doors. For the first time all evening, Eveline could breathe properly. Adrian stood beside the railing silently for several moments. You dislike society, he said eventually. You say that as though it surprises you. You hide it well. Eveline glanced sideways at him. And you? His expression turned unreadable again. I stopped caring whether people noticed. The honesty in his voice unsettled her unexpectedly. Not because it sounded cold. Because it sounded lonely. Below them, carriage lanterns glowed against snowy streets while music drifted faintly into the night. Eveline should have remembered this moment as dangerous. Instead she remembered it later as the exact second everything began changing. Because Adrian Ravenshire turned toward her fully beneath the winter sky and said quietly. You are very different from what I expected, Lady Eveline. And for reasons she could not explain. That frightened her more than the rumors ever had. Blackthorne Castle stood like a shadow against the northern cliffs. Massive stone walls rose above frozen forests while grey clouds drifted low across the winter sky. The carriage wheels cracked over icy ground as Eveline stared out the window, trying to steady the nervousness tightening inside her chest. Beside her, Adrian Ravenshire sat in silence. He had spent most of the journey reading letters from London, calm and unreadable as always. Yet every so often, Eveline caught him glancing toward her as though checking whether she regretted coming. The truth was far more dangerous. She no longer knew how to stop wanting to stay. When the carriage finally stopped before the castle entrance, servants immediately appeared despite the heavy snowfall. Torches flickered against black stone while cold wind swept through the courtyard. Adrian stepped down first. Then he turned and offered Eveline his hand. Simple. Natural. But something about the gesture unsettled her every single time. Because no man had ever treated her gently without expecting something in return. Adrian waited patiently. Eveline finally placed her hand in his. Warmth spread instantly through her fingers despite the freezing air outside. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the head servant said with a bow. Home. The word echoed strangely in Eveline's chest. Inside, Blackthorne Castle felt enormous and quiet. Long candlelit corridors stretched endlessly beneath painted ceilings while massive fireplaces filled the halls with warmth. Yet despite the castle's size, nothing felt cold or empty. It felt lived in. The servants respected Adrian without fear. Guards greeted him naturally. Older staff members spoke to him with loyalty that could not be faked. Eveline noticed it immediately. This was not the household of a cruel man. Over the following weeks, she began seeing more pieces of the real Adrian Ravenshire. He woke early every morning to inspect estate records personally. He remembered every servant's name. He read constantly. And when he thought no one was watching, there was sadness in him so quiet it almost disappeared beneath his composure. One snowy evening, Eveline found him alone in the castle library. Firelight danced across shelves filled with ancient books while snow tapped softly against the tall windows. Adrian stood near the fireplace holding a glass untouched in his hand. "You hide here often," Eveline said softly. He glanced toward her. "So do you. That is different." "How?" "I like books." One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "And I dislike people. We all survive somehow." Eveline laughed quietly before she could stop herself. Adrian looked at her then. Really looked at her. The warmth in his eyes made something inside her chest tighten painfully. "You laugh more here," he said. The observation startled her. "You notice too much." "I notice you." The room went still. Eveline looked away first. That became the problem. Every day near him became easier. Too easy. Morning walks through the snow-covered gardens turned into long conversations beside frozen fountains. Evenings beside the fire became stolen moments filled with quiet smiles and lingering glances neither of them acknowledged aloud. One night during supper, Adrian reached across the table to remove a loose thread caught on Eveline's sleeve. The movement lasted only seconds. But neither of them spoke afterward for nearly a minute. Because both of them had felt it. The closeness growing between them no longer resembled pretense. And Eveline was beginning to forget it had ever started as one. Weeks later, while walking through the eastern wing of the castle, Eveline discovered a locked music room hidden behind heavy oak doors. Curiosity drew her inside. Dust covered the piano near the windows. Old sheet music rested untouched beside candleholders long burned empty. Then she noticed the portrait above the fireplace. A beautiful young woman with dark hair stood beside a smiling Adrian several years younger than he was now. Happy. Open. In love. Eveline stared quietly at the painting. She was called Isabella. Adrian's voice behind her startled her completely. He stood in the doorway watching the portrait with unreadable eyes. My former fiancée, he continued calmly. Eveline swallowed. I did not mean to intrude. You did not. Silence settled heavily between them. She left me for my closest friend 3 months before the wedding, Adrian said quietly. London enjoyed discussing it for years afterward. Eveline's chest tightened painfully. Now she understood. The rumors. The coldness people described. The distance in his eyes sometimes. They turned you into a villain because you were hurt, she whispered. A humorless smile crossed his face. People prefer monsters. They are easier to understand. Eveline looked at him carefully. You are not frightening, Adrian. The use of his first name changed something instantly between them. His gaze darkened slightly. You should be careful saying things like that. Why? He stepped closer slowly. Because I may begin believing you. The air between them felt suddenly too warm. Too close. Eveline's heartbeat stumbled painfully against her ribs. For one dangerous second, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, Adrian looked away first. As fascinating as this conversation is, he said quietly, composure returning, you should avoid this wing after dark. The floors are unstable. Then he left. Eveline stood motionless in the music room long after he was gone. That night she could not sleep. Because she realized something terrifying. She was falling in love with him completely. Spring arrived slowly across Blackthorne lands. Snow melted from the hills while pale flowers began appearing beside the castle paths. The entire estate seemed lighter somehow. Especially Adrian. He smiled more now. Not often. But enough for Eveline to notice. Enough for the servants to notice too. One afternoon while walking through the gardens, an older housekeeper approached Eveline with a knowing smile. I have not seen His Grace this happy in years. Eveline felt heat rise immediately to her cheeks. You exaggerate. I do not. The woman smiled gently before continuing down the path. Eveline remained standing among the flowers, unable to stop smiling slightly herself. Then disaster arrived. Lady Margaret Hensley entered Blackthorne Castle 3 days later without warning. She descended from her carriage dressed in deep crimson velvet, beautiful in the sharp dangerous way of someone fully aware of her power. Eveline disliked her instantly. Margaret had spent years attempting to secure Adrian's attention. Society had practically expected their marriage eventually. Apparently Adrian had never encouraged the idea. Still, jealousy burned visibly in Margaret's eyes the moment she saw Eveline standing beside him. What an unexpected surprise, Margaret said smoothly. Her smile never reached her eyes. Adrian's expression cooled immediately. You should have written before arriving. And missed the excitement? Margaret replied lightly. London is filled with rumors about your mysterious fiancé. Eveline sensed danger immediately beneath the woman's elegance. Margaret turned toward her with false sweetness. Lady Eveline. I have heard so much about you. I suspect none of it pleasant. Margaret's smile sharpened. How intelligent. That evening tension spread across the castle like smoke. During supper, Margaret watched Adrian and Eveline constantly. Every glance between them seemed to irritate her further. Then she delivered the first blow. I heard your sister disappeared, she said casually while sipping wine. Eveline froze. Adrian looked up instantly. What? Margaret tilted her head innocently. Oh dear. Were you not informed? Lady Rosalind fled England with Captain Whitmore nearly 2 weeks ago. The room went silent. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Rosalind. Dear God. Lord Cedric must be furious. Margaret continued smoothly. Unfortunately, their carriage was later found abandoned near the northern roads. Fear hit Evelyn so hard she nearly stopped breathing. Abandoned. Adrian noticed her expression immediately. Enough, Margaret. But Margaret was not finished. London already assumes scandal, of course. Especially considering how quickly your engagement appeared afterward. Evelyn understood the meaning beneath the words instantly. Margaret suspected something. That night Evelyn could barely breathe beneath the crushing weight of guilt returning stronger than ever before. Everything had begun with lies. And now people were getting hurt. She stood alone beside the balcony outside her room when Adrian finally found her hours later. Cold wind moved through the darkness while distant thunder rolled across the hills. You have been avoiding me all evening, he said quietly. Evelyn kept staring into the night. Rosalind could be in danger. We do not know that. She should never have fled. Adrian studied her carefully. You are hiding something. The words landed heavily between them. Evelyn closed her eyes. Not now. Please not now. Adrian stepped closer. Evelyn. She turned toward him finally. And the concern in his face nearly destroyed what remained of her control. I cannot do this anymore, she whispered. The storm around them seemed to grow louder. What does that mean? Adrian asked softly. Tears burned behind her eyes. The masquerade, our engagement, none of it happened naturally. Silence. Adrian went completely still. Evelyn forced herself to continue. Rosalind loved Elias Whitmore. Father intended to offer her to you. Her voice shook violently now. She begged me to distract you long enough for them to escape together. Adrian said nothing. Not a single word. That frightened her more than anger would have. It was supposed to be temporary, she whispered desperately. I never intended for this to happen. This? Evelyn's heart broke at the quietness in his voice. Us. Everything between us. I thought if you knew the truth, tears finally slipped down her face. You would hate me. Adrian looked away sharply. For the first time since meeting him, she saw genuine pain crack through his composure. Not rage. Worse. Heartbreak. You believed I could not possibly choose you willingly, he said quietly. No. That is what frightens you most, isn't it? His voice remained painfully calm. That someone might actually love you enough to stay. Evelyn could not answer. Because he was right. Adrian stepped backward slowly. Every movement looked controlled with visible effort. I need air. Adrian. But he was already walking away. Evelyn stood frozen beneath the storm, unable to stop trembling. The next morning, Blackthorne Castle felt unbearably empty. Adrian had left before sunrise for London. Without saying goodbye. Without telling anyone when he would return. And for the first time in years. Evelyn realized what true loneliness actually felt like. Winter settled over London like ash. Snow covered the rooftops of the city while carriage wheels cut through frozen streets beneath grey skies. Everywhere Evelyn looked, people whispered behind gloved hands the moment she entered a room. She heard the rumors constantly now. The Ashford girl trapped the Duke. She manipulated him from the beginning. No wonder he left Blackthorne Castle alone. Every word struck like another stone against bruised skin. Still, Evelyn remained standing. Because for the first time in her life, she understood something clearly. Losing Adrian frightened her more than society ever could. The royal winter gathering was held inside Valemount Palace 3 nights after her arrival in London. Nobles from across England filled the enormous ballroom beneath golden chandeliers while musicians played softly near the marble staircase. Eveline almost turned back twice before entering. But she forced herself forward anyway. Her silver gown shimmered beneath candlelight while snow still clung faintly to the edges of her cloak. Conversations quieted as she crossed the ballroom alone. No Adrian. Not yet. The emptiness beside her felt unbearable. You are brave to appear publicly. Lady Margaret Hensley's voice slid through the crowd like poison wrapped in silk. Eveline turned slowly. Margaret stood near the staircase dressed in deep crimson, beautiful and triumphant. Several noblewomen surrounded her already watching eagerly for scandal. I grow tired of hiding, Eveline replied calmly. Margaret smiled. How admirable. But there was cruelty behind the elegance. You know, Margaret continued lightly, London becomes far more entertaining when people finally reveal their true nature. Eveline held her gaze steadily. If you have something to say, Lady Margaret, say it plainly. The ballroom gradually quieted around them. People sensed drama the way wolves sensed blood. Margaret stepped closer. Very well. Her smile sharpened. Tell me, Lady Eveline, did you enjoy deceiving the Duke of Blackthorne from the beginning, or did guilt arrive afterward? Whispers exploded instantly through the room. Eveline felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward her. Margaret continued before she could answer. The entire courtship was a performance. Her voice carried clearly now. A distraction so your sister could escape with her soldier lover while you secured yourself a duke. Shock spread rapidly among the guests. Some looked horrified. Others looked delighted. Eveline stood perfectly still despite the humiliation burning through her chest. Margaret smiled wider, sensing victory. Poor Adrian Ravenshire. She shook her head with false sympathy. After everything he suffered, he allowed himself to be fooled again. The cruelty of the words hit harder because they were partially true. Eveline lowered her eyes briefly. Perhaps she deserved this. Perhaps losing him was punishment for every lie. I did deceive him, she said quietly. The ballroom fell even more silent. Margaret blinked, surprised by the honesty. Eveline lifted her head again. But not because I wanted his title. Oh. Margaret crossed her arms smoothly. Then why? Because I loved him before I understood it. Because he looked at me like I mattered. Because he became the safest thing in my life. But Eveline could not force the words past the ache in her throat. Margaret saw the silence as weakness. How tragic, she murmured loudly enough for the crowd to hear. A woman willing to build happiness on lies. The ballroom doors suddenly opened. Cold winter air swept through the hall. And every conversation stopped instantly. Adrian Ravenshire had arrived. He stood at the entrance dressed entirely in black as always, snow melting slowly across his coat. But there was something different about him tonight. No distance. No calm detachment. There was purpose in the way he entered the room. The crowd immediately parted for him. Eveline's breath caught painfully in her chest. For one terrible second, she feared he would look at her with disappointment. Instead Adrian walked directly toward her without glancing at anyone else. Margaret's expression brightened confidently. Clearly she expected him to end the engagement publicly. The entire ballroom waited. Adrian stopped beside Eveline. Close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from him despite the winter cold. Then, without hesitation, he removed one glove and took her trembling hand in his. Gasps spread across the room. Margaret's smile vanished instantly. Adrian finally turned toward the crowd. If deception brought her to me, he said calmly, then I shall thank God for the deception. Complete silence followed. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Eveline stared at him in shock. Adrian looked down at her then, and the expression in his eyes nearly shattered what remained of her composure. Not anger. Not pity. Love. Entirely open and unguarded. You believed I left because I stopped loving you, he said quietly enough that only she could hear. Tears burned immediately behind her eyes. I thought you hated me. Adrian's thumb brushed lightly against her hand. I left because I needed time to survive how much I loved you. The words stole the breath from her lungs. Around them, society watched in stunned silence. Margaret stepped forward sharply. She lied to you. Yes, Adrian replied calmly. And you forgive her? Adrian finally looked toward Margaret fully. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. You speak as though love has ever been simple. Margaret opened her mouth again, but Adrian continued before she could speak. She deceived me at the beginning. His voice remained perfectly steady. But every moment afterward was real. Then he turned back toward Eveline completely, ignoring the rest of the ballroom as though no one else existed. You once asked if I could truly choose you willingly, he said softly. Eveline felt tears slipping silently down her face now. Adrian stepped even closer. There has never been another choice for me. The room blurred around her. Years of silence. Fear. Loneliness. Every wall she had spent her life building began collapsing at once. Adrian slowly lowered himself onto one knee before her. The entire ballroom gasped again. Adrian. Hush, he murmured gently. Then the feared Duke of Blackthorne looked up at her with more vulnerability than anyone in England had probably ever witnessed. Will you still choose me now, he asked quietly, when there is nothing left to hide? Eveline broke completely then. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she nodded shakily. Yes. Her voice cracked painfully. Yes, I will always choose you. Relief crossed Adrian's face so powerfully it almost looked like heartbreak healing in real time. He rose immediately and pulled her into his arms before she could say anything else. The ballroom erupted into stunned whispers around them. But Eveline barely heard any of it. Because Adrian held her like someone terrified of losing her again. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely safe. Then suddenly the palace doors burst open once more. A servant hurried inside breathless from the cold. Lady Eveline Ashford and Captain Whitmore have arrived from Scotland. The ballroom exploded into chaos again. Eveline pulled back in shock just as Rosalind appeared near the entrance wrapped in a heavy traveling cloak beside Elias Whitmore. Alive. Safe. Rosalind immediately burst into tears when she saw her sister. Moments later both women collided into each other's arms laughing and crying at once. You frightened me to death, Eveline whispered shakily. Rosalind laughed through tears. The carriage broke near the northern roads. We were stranded for days. Elias bowed apologetically beside them. I assure you, none of it was intentional. Adrian's hand settled gently against Eveline's back. Warm. Steady. Real. For the first time in months, hope finally felt stronger than fear. Several days later, Lord Cedric Ashford requested a private meeting with Eveline at his London estate. She entered his study nervously expecting anger. Instead she found her father standing beside the window unusually quiet. Age seemed suddenly more visible in him somehow. He turned slowly when she entered. I handled this poorly, he said without introduction. Eveline blinked in surprise. Her father rarely apologized. In fact, she could not remember hearing one before. I spent years believing strength meant control, he continued quietly. Titles. Arrangements. Reputation. Silence filled the study. Then his voice softened slightly. But watching you willing to lose everything for love, he paused heavily. I realized I nearly lost my daughter because I never once asked what made her happy. Emotion tightened painfully in Evelyn's chest. Lord Cedric looked away briefly before speaking again. Does he truly care for you? A small smile appeared despite the tears threatening her eyes. Yes. Her father nodded once. That is enough, then. It was not a perfect reconciliation. But it was real. And somehow that mattered more. Spring arrived over Blackthorne Castle beneath clear blue skies and fields covered in wildflowers. The wedding took place beside the castle gardens overlooking the northern cliffs. Nobles travelled from across England to witness the marriage between Adrian Ravenshire and Eveline Ashford. But none of that mattered to Evelyn. Because the only thing she noticed was Adrian waiting for her beneath the sunlight. He looked at her the same way he had during the masquerade months earlier. Like the rest of the world disappeared when she entered it. When Evelyn finally reached him, Adrian leaned slightly closer and whispered softly enough that only she could hear. You are still frighteningly beautiful. She laughed quietly through nervous tears. And you are still dangerous. A slow smile crossed his face. Only for you. Years later, the people of England would still tell stories about the Duke of Blackthorne. But the stories changed. No longer cruel. No longer feared. Instead they spoke about the man who loved his Duchess so completely that even heartbreak could not make him leave her behind. 6 years after their wedding, spring sunlight filled the gardens of Blackthorne Castle while a small dark-haired girl ran laughing through the flowers. Their daughter. Clara Ravenshire. She had Adrian's sharp eyes and Evelyn's stubbornness, which Adrian claimed daily was an impossible combination. One warm afternoon Clara climbed into Evelyn's lap beneath the garden trees while Adrian stood nearby speaking with servants. Mother? Yes, darling. The little girl looked toward Adrian curiously. Were you afraid of father when you first met him? Evelyn smiled softly. Across the garden, Adrian looked up immediately as though he could somehow sense them talking about him. Sunlight touched the dark edges of his hair while wind moved gently through the flowers around him. Dangerous. Protective. Home. Yes, Evelyn answered quietly. Clara's eyes widened. You were. Evelyn looked at her husband again. Then she smiled. Until I realized he was the safest place I would ever find.